This content is a work of fiction inspired by regional folklore, urban legends, cultural storytelling traditions, and anecdotal reports submitted online. While presented in a documentary narrative format for immersion and entertainment, no claims are made regarding the factual accuracy of the events described. Join the Red Sky Collective, subscribe, like, and activate notifications so you're among the first to receive our next classified case file.
The engine of the Isabella was not a constant sound, it was a rhythmic, staggering plea for rest, a desperate hammering against the smothering humid silence of the ocean night. Below the rusted deck plates, the air was a thick, volatile soup of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, fear, and the metallic tang of old seawater that permeated every fiber of the ship's ancient structure. 62 souls were packed into the stifling hold, paying dearly for the dangerous passage north, each one a whisper of desperation carried across the Gulf Stream. This heat, however, was worse than the usual tropical oppression. It was an inert, unnatural blanket that seemed to absorb sound and movement, a heat that pressed down not just on the skin, but directly on the lungs. This was the edge of the world's most notorious maritime graveyard, the place where coordinates became suggestion and physics often took a sabbatical. Elias pressed his back against a clammy bulkhead, his breath shallow, conserving the meager oxygen. He had crossed boundaries before, navigated the cruelties of cartels and the indifference of bureaucracy, but this specific stretch of water held an altogether different, colder kind of dread. The deep, rolling silence outside the hull, broken only by the sporadic, struggling cough of the engine, was the first true warning. Usually, the ocean spoke, waves lapped, gulls cried, fish jumped. Here, there was nothing. A vacuum pressed against the hull, suggesting a profound emptiness or, far worse, a density of listening things. The Isabella was less a ship and more a floating coffin designated for marginal populations, its registry intentionally murky, its route a drunken zigzag meant to confuse patrol cutters and evade satellite surveillance. Captain Ronaldo, a man whose skin was the color of old leather and whose eyes perpetually reflected the light of a distant, internal rage, had promised speed and discretion. What he delivered was panic and the unmistakable feeling of being profoundly lost, even when they were, technically, exactly where they shouldn't be, navigating the westernmost tendrils of the Bermuda Triangle, a geographical anomaly Ronaldo had dismissed as folklore invented by nervous tourists. Tonight, folklore felt like fact. They were approximately 150 nautical miles from the Florida coast, close enough to smell salvation, yet farther than they had ever been from safety. The tension aboard was palpable, stretched taut like a cheap wire ready to snap. The passengers feared capture, they feared drowning, they feared Ronaldo's capricious violence. But tonight, the conflict shifted. It started with the instruments. At 2:47 hours, the ship's antiquated GPS unit, a flickering green screen bolted precariously above the helm, went dark, not with a failure, but with a sudden, silent erasure. The backup failed immediately after. Ronaldo, usually quick to shout obscenities, merely stared at the silent screen, a creeping sobriety washing over his face like cold bilge water. Simultaneously, the magnetic compass, which had maintained a steady, if slightly inaccurate bearing for days, began to dance. Not a gentle wobble, but a frantic, epileptic spin, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once, completely divorced from the Earth's magnetic field. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, and certainly not the kind of sound that would register on conventional sonar. It was a low-frequency, subsonic thrumming, a deep vibration that seemed to originate not from the environment, but from the very core of the ocean itself. This hum resonated through the metal hull and into the bone marrow of everyone aboard. It felt like a massive, underwater bell being struck miles away, muffled by impossible depths, yet somehow projecting its pressure wave directly into the chest cavity. It was the sound of colossal weight moving deliberately. This phenomenon immediately opened several unsettling loops. Was the magnetic collapse a precursor to a storm, or was it the signature of something else, something that warped local physics? What monstrous engine was generating that skull-splitting, low-frequency pressure? And why, since the hum began, had every single electronic device, not just navigation, but flashlights, radio, even the simple quartz watches worn by the crew, begun to stutter and fail. The very atmosphere seemed hostile to human technology, stripping the Isabella of its fragile tether to civilization. Driven by a paralyzing curiosity mixed with the desperate need for fresh air, Elias managed to bribe a young, nervous deckhand named Ramon with a crumpled wad of bills for 10 minutes above deck. The heat below was claustrophobic, the air above, however, offered no relief, only a different kind of terror. Stepping onto the main deck, the first thing Elias noticed was the unnatural cold. In the humid, stifling tropics, the air should have been bathwater warm. Instead, it carried a biting chill, a sterile cold that felt out of place and out of time. The stars above, usually numerous and brilliant in the unpolluted night sky, were strangely muted, as if a layer of viscous oil lay between the atmosphere and the cosmos. He walked to the starboard railing, the metal rough beneath his fingertips, searching the water. The sea was not the churning, frothy black of a healthy ocean. It was an absolute, featureless obsidian void, reflecting no light, swallowing every ray projected onto it. And then, he saw them. Far off, beneath the absolute darkness of the surface, were lights. They were not the diffuse, scattered flicker of bioluminescent plankton. These were purposeful, intense light sources, a clinical, piercing blue, arranged in impossibly straight lines and sharp, geometric angles. They moved with a speed and precision that defied any known submersibles or deep-sea military drones. They accelerated without sound, traversed vast distances in seconds, and performed 90-degree turns without any discernible inertia, movements entirely alien to the dynamics of water. Elias watched in horrified fascination as the distant patterns began to close the distance. One set of lights, 3 precise, vertically stacked points, halted abruptly, not 50 yards from the ship's stern. They hung there, stationary, observing. They pulsed, once, a silent blink that felt less like a signal and more like an assessment. The pattern of terror was escalating rapidly. First, the systemic failure of technology, second, the physiological imposition of the low hum, third, the visual confirmation of the non-human surveillance. The progression found its terrible peak minutes later. The blue lights had disappeared temporarily beneath the hull, and the low-frequency thrum had intensified into a tangible, painful vibration. It was a pressure cooker of escalating sensory overload. A burst of raw, terrified sound ripped through the night, a high-pitched, guttural scream that belonged to one of the engine room crew, a man named Julio who had been performing a futile check on the disabled mechanics. Julio burst onto the main deck, eyes wide, pointing a trembling finger toward the port side. He was incoherent, babbling about shadows and impossible size. Reynaldo, jolted into a state of panic far beyond his habitual drunken stupor, stumbled out of the wheelhouse, gripping an antique, salt-pitted rifle. "What in God's name is that?" he roared, his voice cracking. Before anyone could fully process Julio's terror, the invisible mechanism that had been circling the Isabella struck. It was not a collision, it was a targeted, surgical intervention. The section of the port railing nearest Julio suddenly warped inward. The thick, half-inch steel groaned, not bending, but tearing with a sickening, wet friction, as if scored by an immense, unseen blade. And then, whatever had made the scoring motion gripped. Julio didn't fall, he was yanked. One moment he was screaming, the next he was airborne, dragged horizontally over the ruined railing. There was no splash when he hit the water. Instead, there was a momentary, awful sound, a sound like a canvas sail being ripped in half, followed instantly by the complete, horrifying return of silence. The sudden, brutal loss of a man, executed with such cold, silent precision, was the secondary hook, the definitive proof that the danger was no longer the sea or the police, but an active, intelligent predator. Reynaldo's rifle slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the deck. The noise seemed deafening in the ensuing, profound silence. The low-frequency hum had stopped completely. The vacuum was absolute. Elias, frozen at the starboard rail, risked a glance over the water toward the spot where Julio had been. The intense blue lights had returned, converging directly beneath the hull. Now, as they moved, their intensity increased, piercing the dark water with such force that they illuminated a terrifying, brief vista of the deep. The grand, horrifying revelation was not a sea creature, nor was it a conventional submersible. They were observing vast, dark geometries, structures of such colossal scale that the Isabella looked like a barnacle clinging to a rock. These were colossal, silent, non-reflective forms, blacker than the water, their surfaces suggesting impossible metallic alloys or perhaps something biological extruded into precise, mathematically perfect shapes. They moved in perfect synchronization, surrounding the entire length of the freighter, lifting it slightly in the water with their sheer displacement. The spinning compass and the dead GPS finally made sense. This was a localized distortion field, a zone enforced by these immense, silent architects of the deep. They were not lost in the Bermuda Triangle, they had been found by the things that created the Bermuda Triangle. They weren't just observing the ship, they were assessing the cargo. The structures seemed to be running dark, silent fingers along the keel, scanning the human freight within. The hidden ones, long relegated to legend, were real, and the Isabella had sailed directly into their harvest zone. The ship shuddered violently, a sickening, grinding shock that ran from stern to bow, instantly killing the engine's last, desperate gasp. All the remaining lights, including the meager emergency lantern, vanished. They were plunged into a total, oppressive darkness, adrift and blind, surrounded by the silent, colossal geometries beneath them. The initial phase of the journey, the grueling escape from poverty, was over. A new, terrifying transit had begun. The Isabella was no longer a transport vessel, it was bait. They needed to understand the mechanics of Julio's disappearance, the method of the silent kill, and what exactly those huge, geometric shapes planned to do next with their human catch. The silent, cold predation of the hidden ones was only beginning to surface, and the question remained, how many of the 61 remaining souls would survive the systematic, chilling harvest that was about to commence? The immediate aftermath was not silence, but a profound, resonant echo that vibrated not just through the shallow wooden hull of the cramped vessel, but through the very bone marrow of the 50 souls crammed within it. The sound, that impossible, subsonic thrumming, had ceased, yet the residual pressure lingered, tightening chests and making the membrane of the eardrums feel perpetually stretched. It was the sound of something unimaginably large having existed momentarily too close, a void collapsing into sudden, unnatural proximity. Marco, the captain, whose face was a ruin of salt-caked fear and desperation, gripped the useless wheel, his knuckles white against the peeling varnish. He had spent 2 decades trafficking human misery across this stretch of water, navigating storms, patrols, and the capricious malice of the currents, yet this was different. This was not the ocean's indifference, this was focused, cold, clinical attention. The navigation panel, which moments ago had flickered with the erratic ghosting typical of the triangle, now displayed only a blank, oily blackness, mirroring the water outside. All digital contact was severed. They were adrift in a sensory vacuum, their precise coordinates swallowed by the electromagnetic indigestion of the region. The desperate migrants huddled below deck, a tangle of limbs and failing hope, had moved past simple terror and entered a state of catatonic dread. They were not screaming, their fear was too deep, too primal for vocalization. Instead, a series of low, guttural whimpers and the wet sound of suppressed weeping permeated the bilge air, thick with petrol fumes and unwashed bodies. They understood the mathematics of their situation better than the captain, they had risked everything to escape certain death or despair on land, only to find a new, metaphysical horror awaiting them on the sea. Their desperation had made them blind to the warnings inherent in the vast, empty expanse of the deep ocean, but now the ocean was asserting its dominance, revealing its true, terrifying occupants. The air temperature had dropped sharply, a sudden, localized inversion that created a thick, pearlescent mist, swirling low over the water surface despite the lack of prevailing wind. It was not ordinary fog, it possessed a faint, almost imperceptible sheen, like pulverized mica, catching the limited, sickly light filtering down from the weak, overcast sky. When the mist touched exposed skin, it did not feel cold, but rather imparted a chilling sensation of unnatural sterility, as if the air itself had been stripped of all biological warmth. Ramon, Marco's sole deckhand, a hulking man hardened by years of petty crime and maritime smuggling, stumbled back from the railing. He had been checking the lines, attempting to restore some illusion of control, but what he saw beneath the surface had robbed him of speech. He pointed a trembling, calloused finger at the water, his breath rasping, "The wake. There is no wake." He was correct. Though the vessel still drifted, rocked by phantom swells, the smooth, dark water immediately surrounding the boat was unnaturally placid. Any disturbance caused by the vessel's slow movement or the displacement of the hull dissipated instantaneously, as if the water molecules themselves were refusing to hold memory of their passage. It was a silence in hydrodynamics, a profound violation of fluid physics that suggested an immense external pressure was surrounding and compressing their little world, absorbing all movement, all energy. The entity, the not human, was not merely passive anymore. It was engaging in a slow, systematic reconnaissance. Below deck, the pattern of escalation became chillingly apparent. Among the terrified passengers was an elderly woman named Elena, who had clutched a worn, leather-bound prayer book throughout the entire journey. She had been a steadying influence, her quiet reciting of ancient litanies a fragile bulwark against the rising panic. But now, she suddenly stopped. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, stared fixedly at a point near the floorboards, where a thin, black film of stagnant seawater pooled. It wasn't the water itself that transfixed her. It was the movement in the water. Not a ripple, but an oscillation, a subtle, structured vibration that resembled nothing organic. It looked, impossibly, like geometric shapes being drawn and erased beneath the thin surface tension of the dirty water, squares, triangles, repeating crystalline structures that existed for a fraction of a second before melting back into the undifferentiated blackness. Elena didn't scream. She simply made a sound that was less a human noise and more the tearing of dry cloth, and then, completely without warning, her grip on the prayer book slackened. The book fell into the bilge water. But as it fell, it did not soak immediately. Instead, as the leather touched the water, the surface tension seemed to stretch and harden. The book was sucked down rapidly, not by gravity or buoyancy, but by a sudden, localized pull. The water closed over it instantly, leaving behind no bubble, no evidence of its swallowing. It was as if the water beneath the boat had briefly become a pressurized vacuum that specifically targeted the object of faith. This was the entity's method: subtle extraction, targeted disruption. It was picking at the threads of their reality, testing the boundaries of their psychological endurance and their physical integrity. Marco, hearing the commotion below, sent Ramon down to investigate. Ramon descended into the suffocating hold, the metallic stench of fear assaulting him. He found Elena rocking silently, tears carving paths through the grime on her cheeks. He didn't see the geometric patterns, he only saw the terror. But then, the engine sputtered. The ancient diesel motor, which had been the unwavering, albeit smoky, heart of their transit, suddenly coughed, seized, and died with a final, mournful clank. Marco instinctively rushed to the ignition, cursing in rapid, rhythmic Spanish, trying to crank it back to life. Nothing. Only the sickening, empty click of the solenoid. It wasn't a mechanical failure born of wear and tear. It was abrupt, total, and accompanied by a peculiar side effect: a strange, almost musical hum began emanating from the engine block itself. It was high-pitched, harmonic, and seemed to resonate exactly at the frequency that made human teeth ache. Ramon, climbing back up, put his hand on the metal casing near the exhaust manifold. It wasn't hot, it was impossibly cold, radiating a deep, penetrating chill that felt chemically corrosive. "It's frozen, Marco," Ramon whispered, pulling his hand away quickly. "The metal is singing." This confirmed the captain's escalating dread. Whatever had visited them, it was manipulating fundamental forces. It was absorbing heat, seizing energy, creating localized zones of entropy violation. The engine hadn't just died, its operational capacity had been systematically neutralized by an external, non-thermal force. They were now completely reliant on the currents, drifting deeper into the central, most notorious vortex of the triangle. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting light of the overcast sky and the slow, insidious tightening of the psychological noose. The pearlescent mist thickened, transforming the world outside the boat into a blurred canvas of gray and black. The sound of the surrounding ocean was muffled, distant, as if they were encased in a dome of thick glass. Then came the hydroluminosity. It began not as a light source, but as an absence of light, a deepening of the water's blackness immediately beneath the hull. The water became so dense with absorbed light that it looked like oil, yet it moved with unnatural fluidity. And from this hyperblackness, thin, ephemeral ribbons of light began to spiral upwards. These were not bioluminescent plankton, they were hard, cold, and utterly alien. The light was a sterile white blue, flickering not randomly, but with a deliberate, rhythmic pattern, a complex pulse code of light and shadow, emanating from something vast operating far beneath the abyssal plane. The streaks of light resolved themselves, momentarily, into structures. They looked like filaments, impossibly long, thin strands that seemed to rise hundreds of meters from the deep, converging just beneath the hull. As the light hit the boat, it caused the wood grain to stand out in stark, microscopic detail, illuminating the scratches and imperfections with brutal clarity. One of the immigrants, a young man named Khalil who had been hiding his terror behind a facade of stoic resilience, began to speak rapidly, his voice cracking with unbearable strain. He wasn't speaking to the others, he was addressing the water, the light, the entity itself. He described the starvation, the corruption, the reasons why he fled his homeland, not out of hope for riches, but out of a desperate, primal need to survive. His confession was a raw, unfiltered expression of human trauma laid bare before the cosmic horror. As Khalil's confession reached its frantic peak, one of the light filaments rose higher than the others, curling just below the surface. It shifted its texture. Where it had been purely light, it now gained a momentary, horrific solidity. It was not flesh, not metal, not rock, but possessed the impossible sheen of crystallized sorrow, a substance that seemed to exist purely to transmit pressure. This filament brushed against the hull near the bow. The contact was silent, gentle, yet devastating. Instead of puncturing the wood, the filament performed a localized, molecular rearrangement. A small section of the vessel's wooden planking, about the size of a man's chest, didn't break or splinter. It simply dissolved. The material didn't turn to dust or mush, it vaporized, leaving behind a perfectly smooth, elliptical hole, as clean as if cut by an invisible, high-powered laser. The water rushed in immediately, a cold, hungry torrent, bringing with it the hyperblackness and the terrible blue light. The screams that followed were finally authentic, unleashed not by fear of death, but by the shattering realization that they were being systematically disassembled. Marco and Ramon reacted instantly, scrambling for whatever rags or makeshift plugs they could find, attempting to stem the inflow. But the water pressure was immense, and the hole was growing slowly, infinitesimally, at its edges. The entity was not attacking, it was sampling. It had taken a piece of their structure, studied the composition, and now allowed the water, their natural enemy, to do the secondary damage. The interior of the boat became a chaos of rushing water and frantic movement. The immigrants, who had until now been unified in their silent dread, broke into survival factions, pushing and scrambling away from the encroaching water, compounding the weight imbalance. Ramon, waist-deep in the sudden deluge, looked down into the hole. The light pulsing from beneath was blindingly intense, focused. And in that light, he saw movement that was not water current. He saw form. It was not tentacular, nor serpentine, nor conventionally monstrous. It was architectural. Beneath the boat, surrounding the vessel like a vast, silent cathedral constructed entirely of shimmering, energetic filaments, was a lattice. It pulsed with intelligent rhythm, a three-dimensional web of impossible scale, operating with precision and deliberation. It wasn't organic life as they understood it, it was engineered horror, a vast, complex mechanism studying its small, floating prey. The lattice was not simply holding position, it was subtly shifting. The entire grid was moving closer, slowly enveloping the vessel in its energetic architecture. Ramon pulled himself back, dripping and breathless, his eyes wide and vacant. He couldn't articulate what he had seen, the geometry of the sight defied human language. He could only repeat one word, a choked gasp against the roar of the incoming water, below. It's built below. Marco, exhausted and fighting the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm him, understood the implication. They hadn't stumbled into the entity's territory, they were now being held within its mechanism. The Bermuda Triangle wasn't just a place where things disappeared, it was, at this moment, an active stage for collection. The engine was dead. The hull was compromised. Navigation was non-existent. And now, the light grid beneath them began to pulse with a unified, rapid rhythm, accelerating the slow, agonizing process of their containment. The only sound now, besides the gushing water, was the sustained, high-pitched harmonic resonance emanating from the frozen engine block, a mechanical scream amplified by the surrounding hyperpressure, acting as the entity's own terrible, silent communication beacon. They were trapped, pinned between their own desperate human wreckage and the vast, inhuman structure that had chosen them for its meticulous study. The question was no longer if they would sink, but what the thing beneath the waves intended to harvest once the desperate cargo was finally submerged and neutralized. The true terror was not annihilation, but the realization that annihilation was merely the prerequisite for something far, far worse. The grinding ceased. The ship did not groan or scream anymore, instead, it achieved a new, terrifying status of silence. It was not the absence of sound, but the total cancellation of sound, a vacuum so profound it pressed physically against the eardrums, forcing a deep, internal resonance that threatened to shatter bone. Matteo felt the pressure change the air from a breathable gas into a heavy, viscous medium, thick with the cold, metallic scent of ozone and deep-sea minerals. He and Anya were huddled near the auxiliary rudder access shaft, the last theoretical route to the upper decks, though the decks themselves had long ceased to resemble anything navigable. The ocean was claiming the freighter, not with a surge, but with a deliberate, inverted gravity, a slow, inexorable pull toward something far beneath the measurable floor. Anya watched the water line creeping up the bulkhead. It was wrong. It didn't ripple, it flowed with unnatural smoothness, reflecting the dim emergency lights in strange, distorting angles that suggested the presence of unseen gravitational lenses. This was the entity's breath, the exhalation of the deep structure they had inadvertently sailed into. They realized the Bermuda Triangle was not a region of spontaneous bad luck, but a meticulously maintained hunting blind, a distortion of space woven around an ancient intelligence that fed not on metal or fuel, but on the raw, chaotic energy of fear, desperation, and unresolved transit. They were the perfect prey, undocumented, unmourned, and seeking a passage that defied official channels, the very definition of expendable energy signatures. The true problem manifested not in the water, but in the shadow it cast. A vast, non-reflective darkness seemed to coagulate beneath the ship, a geometry that defied human perception. It wasn't a shadow cast by light, but a gap in light, an absence that drew the eye and swallowed the soul. The sound returned, not as the shattering hum from before, but as a focused, internal percussion. It felt like the core of the ship itself was being tuned, perhaps to act as a receiver or, worse, as a conduit. A wave of focused vibration passed through the deck, not enough to shake the metal, but enough to rattle the organs of the few remaining survivors. Two more figures, huddled further down the corridor, a young woman and an old man, suddenly fell limp, silently, their faces undisturbed. The entity hadn't touched them, it had merely collapsed their internal symmetry, imploded the soft machinery of their existence using precise, localized sonic pressure. The horror was in the cleanliness of the kill. Matteo pulled Anya deeper into the narrow shaft entrance. We have to go up, now. It's not hunting us, it's harvesting the ship. We are just accessories. He gripped a rusted ladder rung, his hands slick with oil and sweat. The open loop of their escape trajectory was rapidly closing. The entity was solidifying, its presence shifting from vibrational manipulation to physical manifestation, or rather, a pseudo-physical manifestation, one that used the surrounding water and pressurized air as its medium. Looking up, Anya saw a flickering. Not a spark, but the air above the ladder seemed to shimmer, separating into layers like heat over asphalt, yet intensely cold. This was the veil thinning. She suddenly understood the fate of all those planes and ships. They hadn't sunk, they had been pulled through the veil, relocated to a space where human physics and biology simply did not apply. The entity was not merely making the ship disappear, it was preparing to ingest the spatial coordinates of the vessel itself. Matteo fumbled with a distress flare, a last-ditch, useless artifact of the human world. He ignited it. The sudden, hot orange light exploded in the oily darkness. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Where the light hit the shimmering air, the cold, geometric distortion recoiled, hissed, not audibly, but in the way the air fractured, momentarily losing its unnatural density. This was the pattern interrupt they needed. Heat, fire, intense light, it was antithetical to the crushing, cold pressure that defined the hidden ones. The heat, Anya gasped, shielding her eyes. It hates the heat. It's too deep, too cold for this light. They scrambled up the ladder. The vibrations grew more frantic, the entity seemingly agitated by the flare's interruption. They reached the cargo bay entrance, now nearly full of water. The flare sputtered, its lifespan too short for their need. Below them, the darkness coalesced into a structure. It was vast, silent, and pulsed with a slow, internal violet light, visible only because it displaced the surrounding blackness. It was non-Euclidean, composed of impossible angles that hurt the mind to look at, a perfect, terrible crystalline lattice constructed from the compressed energy of the deep. This was the entity's physical anchor. It had merged with the lower hull. They emerged onto the main deck. The storm had subsided entirely, replaced by a still, glassy calm that offered no comfort. The sky was wrong. Above them, the stars were visible, but they did not twinkle, they seemed fixed, cold points of light that looked down upon a sea that resembled molten glass. It was in this awful stillness that the greatest revelation occurred, the second hook digging deep into the horror of their situation. Matteo looked over the rail, expecting to see open ocean. Instead, he saw the reason for the inverted gravity. Far, far below, visible through the impossibly clear, still water, was the bottom. But it wasn't the seafloor. It was a vast, sprawling complex of monolithic, black rock structures, humming with that same violet light. They were looking down upon an underwater city, colossal and ancient, a place that predated human history by epochs. The Bermuda Triangle was not a natural phenomenon, it was the location of a submerged, non-human civilization, a deep-sea installation that utilized the local electromagnetic anomalies as a massive, continuous power source for some unknown purpose, and the surface traffic as a convenient, desperate source of energy. The freighter was directly above the primary spire of this city. The ship was not sinking into the ocean, it was descending into the installation's gravitational well, being towed like bait toward the maw of the deep. They had stumbled not onto a natural hazard, but into a perimeter defense system for the hidden ones. The entity, now fully engaged, began to manifest around the ship's perimeter. It wasn't a single creature, but a distributed intelligence that used the environmental pressures to solidify its form. Thin, filament-like structures, blacker than ink and humming with the internal resonance, began to snake up the sides of the ship, searching, probing. These filaments weren't organic or mechanical, they were pure, organized pressure, capable of tearing molecules apart. Anya saw the escape boat davits, rusty but perhaps functional. This was the final, desperate gamble. They had to cut the ship loose from the gravitational anchor. But how? The entire lower hull was now locked in the entity's grip. Matteo suddenly understood the tuning frequency they had felt earlier. The entity was using the ship's own structure, its immense metal bulk, to fine-tune the dimensional shift, ensuring a clean, precise relocation of the vessel and its contents. If they disrupted the ship's structural integrity with a massive, localized counter-frequency, they might rupture the connection, creating a temporary, chaotic hole just large enough for the lifeboat to pass through before the portal snapped shut. He looked at the small, desperate lifeboat swinging precariously over the side. Anya was already working the release mechanism, frantically trying to lubricate the seized pulleys. Matteo knew the escape would be short-lived if the entire ship followed them. The only way to stop the transition was to destroy the medium itself. The engine core, Matteo yelled, the sound weak and swallowed by the oppressive silence. It's using the density of the engines to stabilize the field. If I can reverse the power flow, overload the stabilizers, create a surge, it might disrupt the pull. The path back into the bowels of the ship was suicidal, leading straight into the fully formed manifestation of the Hidden One's anchor. But there was no other option. Survival meant destroying the vessel that was meant to be their cage. Anya pleaded, reaching out. Matteo, no. We can make the boat. The boat will just follow the ship, Anya. We have to break the link. We have to make it loud. He didn't wait for her response. He sprinted back toward the main shaft, taking the fire flare with him. He was no longer running from the predator, he was charging the core of the anomaly, fueled by the terrifying clarity of his imminent fate. Matteo descended into the engine room chaos. The water was waist-high now, steaming slightly where the intense pressure met the remaining heat of the old machinery. The air was thick with the entity's energy, a cold, buzzing static that prickled the skin and tasted of metal. He reached the main console, half submerged. With brutal effort, he forced open the electrical panel, ignoring the painful arcs of current. He saw the remains of the ship's ancient stabilizers, massive, humming rotors designed to keep the cargo steady in rough seas. Now, they were vibrating at the entity's tuned frequency. He took the flare, now burning low, and jammed it into the control nexus, creating a localized short circuit. Then, using a heavy wrench, he smashed the safety override, forcing the remaining, dying batteries to discharge directly into the stabilizer coils, manually reversing the polarity, a move that would destroy the entire core in a catastrophic surge. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The internal hum of the ship changed pitch instantly, from a low, resonant drone to a high, unbearable shriek, a sound that was both sonic and vibrational, ripping through the dense air. It was a counter-frequency designed to tear the dimensional fabric the entity had woven. The world outside erupted. Anya, still working the davit controls, saw the black filaments recoiling from the hull, snapping back toward the deep structures below, screaming their silent, pressure-based agony. The ship was shaking, but this was a structural failure induced from within, a massive sonic suicide bomb. The moment the davit cables finally released, just as the entire hull began to buckle and warp under the internal feedback, Anya dropped the lifeboat into the glassy water. She tumbled in, narrowly avoiding the collapse of the nearest mast. The climax arrived in a single, instantaneous flash of violet and white light. The counter-frequency hit its peak. The freighter did not sink, it did something far worse. It ruptured. The air itself seemed to tear, curling around the vessel. In one violent, deafening snap, a sound that broke the oppressive silence, the entirety of the massive steel freighter, along with Matteo and the monstrous crystalline structure that had anchored itself to the hull, vanished. It wasn't vaporization or sinking. It was erasure. A localized dimensional collapse that left behind only a massive, swirling vortex in the water, quickly calming back into the terrible, glassy stillness. Anya was left floating in the tiny, battered lifeboat, alone, drifting on an ocean that was far too quiet, under a sky that looked like a cold, empty vault. She was surrounded by the evidence of her impossible journey, oil slicks, scattered debris, and the overwhelming, terrifying silence of an environment cleansed of human interference. She was the only witness to the price of crossing the threshold. The Hidden Ones had claimed their harvest, and she was the residue, too insignificant to follow, too chaotic to integrate into their structured consumption. The conclusion was stark and absolute. Anya drifted for 3 days before being spotted by a commercial fishing trawler far outside the known boundaries of the triangle. When she was questioned by border patrols and maritime authorities, her story was met with the expected systemic denial. They categorized the incident as a tragic accident at sea, the freighter listed as lost with all hands due to structural failure and poor maintenance. Mateo, the others, and the non-human intelligence were relegated to the realm of madness and hearsay. She had found passage, but at the cost of her sanity and the burden of terrible knowledge. She had witnessed the true gatekeepers of the American dream, not human patrols, but the ancient, silent, cosmic architects of the deep, who treated human aspiration and fear as nothing more than raw, consumable energy. She was free, but forever marked by the understanding that the missing weren't victims of the sea, but sacrifices to the depths. And so, the vast conspiracy continues, protected not by government agents or hidden dossiers, but by the sheer, insurmountable improbability of the truth. The waters remain silent, the coordinates unchanged, the migration routes still crisscrossed by desperate souls unknowingly sailing toward the hungry maw of the deep. Do you think that the forces tasked with maintaining order and patrolling the borders truly focus on the human factor alone? Or do they operate under a necessary, chilling silence, guarding the veil, knowing that the real border is not the line in the sand, but the atmospheric anomaly protecting the hidden ones below? Do you believe the official reports, or do you listen for the faint, resonant hum that occasionally disrupts the deep, quiet waters of the Bermuda Triangle, the sound of history being erased and the price of passage being paid?